Um, People are bringing their kids and grandkids, which is kind of awesome.
Yeah.
Because I didn't even really realize this when I was making it, but I sort of did. But because the boat is actually named after my two grandmothers. But I had sort of a kind of interesting thing with my two grandmothers who died sort of after a very long life. They were both in their 90s. But one had this very kind of prolonged medical kind of nightmare where they kept her alive sort of for years after they probably should have. And the other had a very kind of decisive way she wanted to approach the end of her life. And in a way that was in the film, is that it's about fighting for every last moment you can get, but also then handing the world off to the next people. You've had your shot at it in a way. And, people going with their kids and their grandkids, it's kind of cool because I think it sort of starts a dialogue there, which in my family had been a little bit lacking.
Yeah. Cool. Sort of my first official question is, Margin Call was renowned for its fantastic, sharp screenplay and obviously got an Oscar nomination in that department. What made you decide to come back with your second feature and make a film with no dialogue, very little dialogue?
Yeah, I can't say it was something that I was aware of while I was doing it. I wrote this while I was editing Margin Call, so thank you for the kind things that you said about Margin Call, but I didn't know that was going to happen, when I wrote this. It was... This was kind of written in a very time of weakness. When you're editing a film, you're sort of at your most fragile. And when you're editing your first film, you're an absolute disaster because you really never know if you're going to get to do it again. And so, in a way, it just happened. I know that sounds crazy, but I started with the letter that begins the film, and then I kind of sat around for, probably a month or two, and then started to formulate the rest of this story of how someone would have gotten in that predicament. And the next thing I knew, I was done. It was 31 pages. It had gotten to the end. And I went back and almost reread it, and I was like, there's no one else in this movie. And anytime I sort of tried to bring in, something that would have brought, someone else into the film, it didn't feel appropriate. And so I guess, the other answer to your question, though, is a year later, I do have choices, and I could go do a lot of different things. Margin Call had sort of come out, but at that point, Mr. Redford had showed real interest in being in this film. I had already offered it to him, and he'd said yes. And, I started to look at other choices, and I guess the simplest way of saying it was, as a filmmaker, the best film that I saw in front of me of all of my options was this one. So I went to it, and it was only later in the middle of editing this movie that I thought, what have I done to myself? Why have I done this?
And how important was that? Because Oscar nomination in getting All Is Lost off the ground, because I can't imagine it would have been the easiest film to sell initially.
No. Mr. Redford attaching himself certainly helped the film gain momentum, but we could have financed the film a lot of different ways, this film, but what my Oscar nomination, which sort of came out of nowhere, did in a very lovely way was allowed us to make the film with total creative control. So it basically allowed us to finance the film without an equity piece and without a real kind of person who was too worried. If someone had been very, very worried about what they were doing, they never would have come into this. And so, my international sales guy, went off to the Berlin film market, I think 4 days after I'd been nominated for an Academy Award, which is the dream period because, everyone's a winner. You get nominated here and you lose here, but in between, everyone's a winner. So I had real momentum when we went to try and finance the film, and it ended up being amazing. It allowed us to kind of make the movie that we wanted to make.
And how was it, as far as experiences go, spending a few weeks on a boat with Robert Redford?
It was months. It was 2.5 months, and it was a very grueling, kind of intense undertaking. That in a weird way, there's stunts and lots of different things happening in the film that hopefully keep the audience on the edge of their seats. But in a way, the film, much like what a character like this is going through, it was the week after week after week of just knowing that you were going to kind of wake up and be wet and only be staring at the same person every day. He had to look at my mug, and there was no other actors to kind of for him to play off of, or for me as a director to kind of work with. And so, towards the end of this, luckily we were able to shoot the film in sequence. And so the last 2 or 3 weeks of shooting are really the last kind of 20 minutes of the film. And it is when this character is kind of going through this very intense emotional experience. And I think the crew and him, certainly on screen as an actor, is kind of going through similar things and kind of exposing himself in a way that he hadn't.
So was it always your intention to cast a sort of an older actor in this role? Because I suppose, obviously, we get his fragility is explored, and he almost has more of a life to contemplate over. So had it not been him, would it have been another actor of his age? Or?
Yes, the project for me, kind of the fascination with it was always, it's sort of two-pronged. One is the fascination is that he refuses to give in. Even though presumably this character has lived a fairly full life and he has a family that you know about, and so that the fact that he just will not quit is kind of fascinating when it's a person who has filled a full life. There's also kind of just a logistical from a filmmaking perspective, which is the fact that everything is a little bit heightened as someone gets older in life, especially kind of a kind of action movie, which in a certain ways at times this film is. The fact that any one step or misstep can kind of change your outcome, like that, just would not have been as interesting to me or as sort of intellectually interesting if it was a 40-year-old guy. It's sort of like, you better be fighting for your life at 40. You still have got a lot of things to do. But this guy, there is something sort of poetic about the fact that that refusal, that kind of human instinct to refuse to give up, is as much alive, if not more so, in a 75-year-old man.
And my final question, I was just wondering, in regards to your next project, A Most Violent Year, if you could tell us a little bit about that. How's that coming along?
It is coming along wonderfully. The script is done. We have a wonderful financier in place. My casting is sort of been a very interesting process. I'll just say that one of the people who has been reported by his representatives may not end up being in the film for all the right reasons, but it was sort of unfortunately prematurely released, who the cast was, which happens, and it's not a big deal. It's sort of unfortunate because audiences sometimes kind of remember that version of the movie, which never existed in a way. But it's a project I'm very, very excited to kind of tackle, and there's an amazing group of actors coming together to help me make it. So it's a luxury to be at this point in my career where I can kind of think up these ideas and people are willing to come with me and make them. It's a gift, and one that I'm hoping to take advantage of. So,
well, we're very much looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely.